Welcome to the 20th IISS Shangri-La Dialogue, or SLD. It is a delight for all of us at the International Institute for Strategic Studies to be convening this Asia Security Summit for the 20th time. I remember well, at the turn of this century, examining the range of latent and prospective geopolitical tensions in the Asia-Pacific region, being struck by the fact that in this region, presidents met, prime ministers met, finance ministers met, foreign ministers met, but there was no established forum for defense ministers to convene multilaterally. Having noticed this gap in the defense diplomatic marketplace, the IISS chose not to write a worthy academic article deploring the absence of a regional security institution and recommending that somehow it emerge and take form. Instead, we decided to seek support to create it ourselves. The IISS had held one of its annual conferences for members in Singapore in the late 1990s. Strategic thinking was a globally recognized special quality of this remarkable city-state. It made sense to consult here. Following conversations I had with President S.R. Nathan and Defense Minister Tony Tan, I was warmly encouraged to proceed. And when I discussed my idea of a defense ministers meeting in Singapore with Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, the guidance I received from the then senior minister was characteristically crisp and challenging. Well, give it a go. And so it was that at the end of May 2002, in the middle of a major crisis between India and Pakistan that some feared could even turn into a nuclear conflict, the IISS convened 14 defense ministers and 160 delegates for the first Asia Security Summit in Singapore. Some asked me why we called it the Shangri-La Dialogue. The answer is this. When I was discussing organizing this unprecedented and sensitive defense event in Asia with a friend, we both agreed that Asia Security Summit sounded perhaps a bit harsh, a bit too sharp, even a bit too edgy. We needed something softer. As we were mulling over this diabolical marketing dilemma, he asked me, well, where are you holding it? I said the Shangri-La Hotel. There it is, he replied. Call it the Shangri-La Summit. That will sound better. I replied, that's an excellent improvement. Though we don't want just to arrive at a summit, we want to facilitate useful conversations, help meetings to take place, create some back and forth between ministers and other delegates. I then made my counter-suggestion. How about Shangri-La Dialogue then? We smiled to each other in immediate, mutual, self-satisfied accord. And thus was born the best sponsorship agreement that a think tank has ever freely and unilaterally offered to a major international hotel chain. Over the years, the SLD has provided the platform for several bilateral and multilateral arrangements to be devised or signed at the dialogue, and has inspired modernized and even new forms of defense cooperation and confidence building. In 2005, 4 countries, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and Thailand, agreed combined maritime air patrols to complement sea patrols in the Malacca Straits, which continue today. After Cyclone Nargis hit Myanmar in May 2008, ministers and military chiefs meeting at the SLD made important advances in determining the conditions by which humanitarian aid could be delivered to the people of Myanmar in a manner that was acceptable to the then government. Prior to the SLD's creation, the Five-Power Defense Arrangement, or FPDA, had fallen into partial disrepair. But with the defense ministers of the UK, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, and Malaysia all regularly attending the SLD, it became easy to refresh and revive the FPDA for contemporary purposes. ASEAN defense ministers attended the SLD from the start in 2002, and it was pleasing that in 2006, the first formal ASEAN defense ministers meeting took place in Kuala Lumpur. 4 years later, in 2010, the inaugural ADMM Plus, including ASEAN's 8 dialogue partners, also convened. The comfort levels earlier achieved at the SLD surely provided the incentives for the creation of these new formal institutions. The Shangri-La dialogue will always take advantage of its informal character to allow some experimentation in the diversity of participants and the structure of the event to keep it fresh and at the forefront of strategic debate. The IISS has no agenda of its own in convening this dialogue other than to create the best possible environment for engagements, both public and discreet, and to inject useful freshness into the strategic debate. This is not an international relations conference. It's a defense ministers' gathering, where questions of strategy are properly front and center. Balance of power, arms control, alliance relationships, emerging technologies and doctrines of warfare, confidence-building measures, international law, national interest, and international stability are the inevitable key reference points. An important goal everyone here shares is to imagine and then create the conditions for strategic stability. Looking back, many rightly in this region are critical of the acrimony and rivalries that characterized the Cold War. Millions of people in many regions suffered because of that long Cold War. There was plenty of Cold War thinking to which we must never return. But not all Cold War thinking was bad. During the Cold War, the principles of mutual nuclear deterrence were developed that helped to prevent the actual use of those weapons. The complex units of account for nuclear arms control were formulated that helped to maintain an agreed balance of power. And arrangements for transparency and confidence building were institutionalized to facilitate diplomacy and to avoid unhappy military surprises between opponents. Despite the huge differences between the competing state systems, periods of détente were found and channels for strategic dialogue were maintained. Any stable security environment needs to find a place for these instruments of strategic peacekeeping, even if importantly adapted to different circumstances and regions. The Indo-Pacific Security Order is delicately poised. We are genuinely proud and frankly relieved that so many of you carrying those responsibilities are present. Spontaneity is rarely a prized feature of traditional diplomacy, but the opportunity provided here for unscripted exchanges or unprepared meetings, we hope might still bear fruit. An accidental diplomatic encounter is better than an accidental military incident. Quite properly, leaders coming to this region are keenly aware of the need to acknowledge ASEAN centrality. In the field of defense diplomacy, at least for one hard-working weekend in the year, I hope that we are permitted to pay decent tribute to Shangri-La dialogue centrality. Acting Prime Minister Wong, Singapore government ministers, and senior officials, would you please accept the thanks of the IISS and all the international delegates gathered here for being such superb hosts and custodians of the IISS Shangri-La dialogue process over 20 years. Let me now move speedily to our keynote address. There are personal reasons why it's a delight for me to receive in Singapore, to deliver the keynote address at the 20th Shangri-La Dialogue, the Prime Minister of Australia. My supervisor, when I was studying for my DPhil at Oxford on French foreign policy in Africa, of all things, was the renowned Australian scholar Hedley Bull. He had authored the classic international relations work, The Anarchical Society, a title he would probably again choose if he were alive today and able to write on contemporary strategic issues. My first job was given to me by the then Australian director of the IISS, Professor Robert O'Neill, who sadly died in April of this year, but did so much when at the IISS to move the Institute's ship beyond its North Atlantic bearings and drop anchor from time to time in other parts of the world, notably in Asia. Those fine Australians, along with many others of their generation, like Professor Coral Bell, did much to teach a younger generation of analysts during the 1980s how to think strategically. The IISS is committed through its Southeast Asian Young Leaders Program to recruit the best regional researchers of the successor generation. I still pass on to young analysts at the IISS the most important thing Hedley Bull taught me, which he summarized in a tidy epigram. Thinking is also research. I conclude from the two inspirational persons I have cited, one Singaporean, one Australian, that finding the right balance between thinking and giving it a go is the task of all strategists, whether civilian or military, political or commercial. Prime Minister Albanese, everyone here recognizes that Australia, under your leadership, has accelerated its defense and security engagements with many Southeast Asian and Pacific Island nations, as well as larger powers such as India and Japan. Your administration has moved expeditiously to complete and publish a defense and security review, and you have been present at all recent major international gatherings at which the international order has been discussed. All of us look forward to your setting the agenda for our deliberations. Prime Minister, the floor and this podium is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and I am delighted to be back in Singapore and here for my first visit as Australia's Prime Minister. I'm grateful to Acting Prime Minister Wong for a very positive and productive leaders' meeting this morning, and I wish my friend Prime Minister Lee a speedy recovery. And I'm deeply honoured that the International Institute for Strategic Studies has invited me to deliver the keynote address at this year's Shangri-La Dialogue. For 2 decades, this highly respected forum has brought together experts in both defence and diplomacy. Long-standing recognition that building peace, security and stability depend on both strategic capability and diplomatic capacity, reinforcing each other. And by bringing together leaders and analysts from across the Indo-Pacific, ASEAN and founding dialogue partners such as Australia, this gathering emphasises the value of frank and constructive discussion, as well as making it clear that preserving peace and security is not a task that any one of us can shoulder alone. Because just as the prosperity of our region has always been driven by shared opportunity, the stability of our region can only be secured through collective responsibility. That emphasis on both agreement and action, cooperation and capacity has always been at the core of this forum, and indeed is at the heart of ASEAN itself. And even as the threats and challenges facing our nations have evolved and multiplied, we have held to the common understanding that we achieve far more together than we do alone. In the context of the current strategic environment, this has never been more important. We sometimes hear our region described as a potential theatre for conflict, as if this is merely a backdrop, a location, an arena for the ambitions of others. Such a view is entirely, and might I say dangerously, wrong. Not only does such a characterisation dismiss the agency and ambition of a majority of the world's population and the engine room of the global economy, it also presents the future of this region as somehow a foregone conclusion. And we've seen the flaw in that kind of thinking in the past. The benign assumption post-Cold War that the spread of globalisation, free trade and new technologies would create a more open, more stable world. Some talked about the end of history, the beginning of a new world order, a unipolar era. There was a strand of complacency underpinning that, meaning governments that didn't always thoroughly examine or properly explain the benefits of trade agreements to our people, as if the virtues of open economies were self-evident. And we didn't always pay sufficient attention to the maintenance and effectiveness of multilateral institutions and global rules. The years that followed provided a sharp correction. The rise of nativism and isolationism, a land war in Europe, and the biggest conventional military build-up since the Second World War in our own region. All proof that peace, prosperity, and stability can never be taken for granted. But the lesson we draw from this must not be that trade and dialogue and rules and people-to-people connections don't support regional and global security. That would only mean being wrong for a second time, but in a different way. To move from imagining conflict is impossible to assuming war is inevitable is just as harmful to our shared goals. The fate of our region is not preordained. It never was, and it never is. What we do here, what we decide here matters for us and the world, and it always will. I can assure you that when Australia looks north, we don't see a void for others to impose their will. We see growing and modernising economies, the fastest growing region of the world in human history. We see the drivers of the global transition to net zero. And we see a community of nations whose actions and decisions are essential to building prosperity and preserving peace in the Indo-Pacific. Peace is not a gift, and it's never a given. It's not the default setting of any part of the world. It has to be built, pursued, defended, and upheld. And when nations such as ours choose to promote peace, we are not opting out from the big questions of security and stability. We are not choosing the smooth ride or the passive course. We are committing to a whole-of-nation effort. And that's my government's focus in Australia, investing in our capability and investing in our relationships, strengthening our deterrence and our diplomacy, and bringing both to our presence in this region, directing both to the ongoing task of maintaining an environment that enables economic competition and guards against strategic conflict. A region and a world where two countries can disagree, even very firmly, without that disagreement ending in disaster. Central to this is the word of the moment, guardrails. Now, I'm a former Minister for Infrastructure, so I confess that when I hear guardrails, my mind goes straight to the safety barriers on the side of major roads. But that's actually not a bad way of thinking about what is being proposed, because this isn't about a policy of containment. It's not a question of placing obstacles in the way of any nation's progress or their potential. This is a matter of simple, practical structures to prevent a worst-case scenario. And the essential precondition for this is, of course, dialogue. Australia strongly supports the renewed efforts from President Biden's administration to establish reliable and open channels of communication between the governments of the United States of America and the People's Republic of China. I want to recognise the very important speech that Prime Minister Li gave in China recently on this subject, where he said this: "Big powers have a heavy responsibility to maintain stable and workable relations with one another, because the alternative, the silence of the diplomatic deep freeze, only breeds suspicion, only makes it easier for nations to attribute motive to misunderstanding, to assume the worst of one another. If you don't have the pressure valve of dialogue, if you don't have the capacity at a decision-making level to pick up the phone, to seek some clarity or provide some context, then there is always a much greater risk of assumptions spilling over into irretrievable action and reaction. The consequences of such a breakdown whether in the Taiwan Strait or elsewhere, would not be confined to the big powers or the site of their conflict. They would be devastating for the world. And that's why, as leaders in this region, and indeed as citizens of it, we should be doing everything we can to support the building of that first and most fundamental guardrail. In Australia, our government has put dialogue at the heart of our efforts to stabilise our relationship with China. We're not naive about this process or its limitations. We recognise there are fundamental differences in our two-nation system of government, our values and our worldviews. But we begin from the principle that whatever the issue, whether we agree or disagree, it is always better and it is always more effective if we deal direct. It is also an acknowledgement of our common interests. We have advocated strongly for the removal of any impediments to our trade, not just because Australian producers benefit from being able to export our high-quality products and resources to our largest trading partner, but because China also benefits from being able to import them. It's a win-win. And that's true on a broader level. China's extraordinary economic transformation has benefited not only its population, China's extraordinary economic transformation has also benefited our entire region. And that is important. But it's also been important for the region. It's been made possible by a regional architecture that facilitates fair trade, encourages the sharing of knowledge, spurs innovation and builds people-to-people connections through education and tourism and business and orderly migration. American leadership has been an indispensable part of this, but we have all played our part, creating a prevailing climate of peace and stability secured by sovereignty. This is where guardrails are absolutely necessary, while of course not being entirely sufficient, because while we welcome any safeguard against a crash, there must also be a set of rules that serve all of us who use the road. This has to go beyond a catalogue of principles or a set of ideals. It must be adaptable for unforeseen challenges like a pandemic. And it must be workable and meaningful, not just to those of you here practice in the artful formulations of statecraft, but to the citizens that we serve. Because the success and survival of the rules-based order depends on it both being fair and being seen as fair, on working and being seen to work, upholding sovereignty, not just for the biggest powers or the loudest voices, but for every nation. Sovereignty that confers on every nation the right to determine its own destiny, to enjoy freedom of action and policy independence, the right to make our own choices, to speak for ourselves and our interests, free of external pressure or duress, to pursue opportunities for our people without fear of coercion or retribution, to have confidence in the integrity of our borders, including our maritime zones, and control of our own resources. If this breaks down, if one nation imagines itself too big for the rules or too powerful to be held to the standards that the rest of us respect, then our region's strategic stability is undermined and our individual national sovereignty is eroded. That's why, for example, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea matters to all of us in this region. Its role is not simply to adjudicate on an incident-by-incident basis. It's to guarantee the security of our communications and our maritime trade and travel, essential for our shared prosperity. The same is true for the rules which govern global trade, where we need to make sure that the deals we arrive at deliver greater opportunity for our people and industries and economies. Because delivering stronger economic stability and facilitating closer exchange between our businesses and educational institutions and citizens is critical to building security in the region. for as long as Australia has made our own foreign policy. Our alliance with the United States has been central to it. Ours has always been a bond of shared values, and it remains a partnership of shared strategic interest, a common determination to preserve stability, prosperity and peace. Australia has also helped to build the regional architecture that has grown to be so important for stability in our region, including recognising the centrality of ASEAN. Of course, Australia has also always been a strong supporter of multilateral institutions and a constructive contributor to them. A great Australian, former Labor leader Doc Evatt, played an instrumental role as an advocate for the formation of the United Nations and was a driving force in the drafting and proclamation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. For Evatt and Australia, this was a matter of principle and practicality because he didn't want the future entrusted to a great power piece alone. He wanted middle powers and smaller nations to have a seat at the table and to be able to make a contribution to their collective security. The wisdom of that approach endures. Of course, as I said before, bilateral dialogue is vital, but when relations are strained, bilateral talks can sometimes be reduced to a list of topics to avoid or be seen and judged through the prism of a single issue to be solved. Whereas multilateral forums, the regional and the global, provide a new perspective, placing points of tension in the broader context where they belong. They safeguard our capacity to argue constructively and disagree respectfully. Might I add, events such as this are part of that process as well. Better still, they remind us what we can achieve when we do agree, the challenges we can overcome if we work together, from climate change to the threat of nuclear weapons. Nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation is a cause I've been passionate about since I was a university student. It's one of the issues that drew me to a life in politics. And I wanted to take this opportunity to acknowledge this region's long-standing commitment to nuclear disarmament. From the creation of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in the 1970s, through to the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty and the Bangkok Treaty in the 1990s, the citizens of this region have shown an unflinching commitment to preventing the spread of these destructive, inhumane and indiscriminate weapons, recognising from the outset that this vital process could not be safely left to the Cold War mindset, with nations operating as counterbalancing pairs. It depended on multilateral rulemaking. Of course, we know this is not a danger that belongs only to history. North Korea's extraordinarily reckless launch of ballistic missiles and Russia's reprehensible threats to use nuclear force underscore the ongoing necessity of cooperative action and global rules to drive disarmament. Multilateral forums also remind us of the opportunities we can grasp if we cooperate in everything from sustainable development to the global shift to clean energy. This understanding is at the heart of Australia's comprehensive strategic partnership with ASEAN, where we are seeking to provide practical support for the outlook on the Indo-Pacific. Because while our existing trade agreements play an important role, we recognise we need to do more here in the region. And that's why my government appointed Australia's first Special Envoy for Southeast Asia, Nicholas Moore, who is driving Australia's Southeast Asia economic strategy to 2040. The strategy will identify new opportunities to strengthen our shared economic future. It will build on Australia's existing contribution to the key needs of Southeast Asian countries, particularly energy security, food security, and infrastructure investment. It's that same spirit of practical partnership that drives our engagement with the Pacific Island Forum, working with our partners, our equals, our neighbours and our family on the basis of respect And whether it is in Australia's engagement in the Pacific, our support for ASEAN and the East Asia Summit, our founding pride in APEC, our faith in the leadership of the G20, none of this is altered or supplanted by our participation in the revitalised Quad, or indeed our new AUKUS agreement. Before I stood alongside President Biden and Prime Minister Sunak to announce Australia's pathway to acquiring conventionally armed nuclear-powered submarines, I ensured that my government spoke with every ASEAN and Pacific partner and many other nations. More than 60 calls, being open and transparent with the region about our intentions, being clear with the region and the world that Australia remains strongly committed to our obligations under the NPT and the Treaty of Rarotonga, and as well to cooperating with the International Atomic Energy Agency to set the highest standards for any country acquiring this capability. More broadly, I think my friend President Widodo made a really valuable point in the course of talking about the goal of making the region a stable and peaceful one when he said that the Quad and AUKUS should work as partners and not competitors. Partners, not competitors. That's very much Australia's view, and it is precisely our approach. The submarines we are acquiring, the single biggest leap in Australia's defence capability in our history, reflect our determination to live up to those expectations, to be a stronger partner and a more effective contributor to stability in our region. Multilateral institutions are essential to writing the rules and keeping them relevant, but reinforcing the rules and upholding them depends on our capability as well. Because Australia was not just one of the first countries to work on creating the United Nations. We were also part of the first UN peacekeeping mission, supporting the independence of Indonesia, backing our words with our deeds. Our government's investments in new capability and technology and personnel are unapologetically about our national defence and our national sovereignty. But they are also an investment in regional stability, strengthening our capacity to contribute to the collective security of the Indo-Pacific, from shared peacekeeping missions such as the Regional Assistance Mission in the Solomon Islands, to providing essential support in times of humanitarian and environmental disaster, most recently in Vanuatu. Australia is determined to deepen this cooperation with more shared exercises building on the recent success of Talisman Sabre and our flagship regional engagement activity, Indo-Pacific Endeavour. In boosting our nation's defence capability, Australia's goal is not to prepare for war, but to prevent it through deterrence and reassurance and building resilience in the region, doing our part to fulfil the shared responsibility all of us have to preserve peace and security, and making it crystal clear that when it comes to any unilateral attempt to change the status quo by force, be it in Taiwan, the South China Sea, the East China Sea or elsewhere, the risk of conflict will always far outweigh any potential reward. Can I conclude by saying that before Shangri-La was an important dialogue, or indeed the name of a hotel, it was an old story. The tale of a remote mountain paradise where time passed more slowly, safely cut off from the cares of the world. Yet for us, as leaders and thinkers and decision makers, Shangri-La is about dealing with uncertain, uneven, fast-moving complexity. Even in the life of this forum, we can see how quickly the ground can shift. When this dialogue first convened, it was in the shadow of the September 11 attacks and on the threshold of new wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. When Kevin Rudd became the first Australian Prime Minister to address this forum in 2009, he said the question at the forefront of every nation's mind was the global financial crisis. He also cautioned against strategic drift and emphasised the need for robust structures in a dynamic environment. We could see the wisdom of that by the time Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull spoke here in 2017, warning of fighters in Syria and Iraq seeking to return to this region and the need for revitalised cooperation against the emerging threat of cybercrime. We can never know for sure the timing or indeed the nature of the next shock that our region will face. The test for all of us is not predicting when that challenge will arise, it's how we respond when it does. Recognising our collective agency and our shared responsibility, understanding that there is no security to be found in isolation, no growth or prosperity to be gained from closing ourselves off from the world, no stability without respect for sovereignty, no lasting peace without engaging with each other and working together. That's why Australia is invested and engaged and committed to Asia and the Indo-Pacific. Australia is engaged, not as a spectator or a commentator, not calling for others to act while we stand and watch, not urging nations down a path we are not prepared to walk ourselves. Australia is engaged as a champion for peace and prosperity in the region and the world, and as a constructive and committed contributor to the solutions, the challenges that all of us will face in the years ahead. Investing in our capability and investing in our relationships, working to shape the future, not waiting for the future to shape us. Thank you very much.
Prime Minister, thank you very much for those remarks, for your endorsement of the importance of multilateral defence diplomacy, for your reminder also that the goals of arms control and non-proliferation still require a lot of hard work to be achieved, a theme that was also raised at the recent Hiroshima G7 summit. We can take one or two questions before going to dinner. Tomorrow morning, you'll be dazzled by the technology of the question and answer period. Tonight, it'll be a rather old-fashioned raise your hand. If I can recognize you, a microphone will gravitate towards you. I see you and Graham there. If you stand, the microphone might move at even greater speed. There you go. Question is yours. Go ahead.
Prime Minister, you referenced Singapore Prime Minister Lee's recent speech in China. Singapore's Defence Minister, Dr. Ng Heng, was in Australia recently, and there he mentioned some very positive things about Australia's potential to play a bigger role in the region, and welcomed Australia's future submarines to call into Singapore's ports. But he also said something surprising, at least I found it surprising, that he said that Australia was not just an Indo-Pacific country, but an Asian country. And it's interesting to me because it's not just about Australia's strategic interests, but Australia's strategic identity. And although I suspect that went down well in Canberra, that identity has other claims upon it. Australia claims to be part of the South Pacific family. Australia has two formal allies, New Zealand and the United States. Both are members of the Five Eyes intelligence community, which is Anglophone in nature. Although the Anglosphere is seen as somewhat passé, it also has a claim, I think, in some senses, to Australia's strategic identity. So I'd just be interested how that sits with your definition of Australia's strategic identity. How would you define it? And where would you locate it?
Well, thanks very much for the question. We are, like other nations, a product of our history. And our history is with the exception of the oldest continuous culture on Earth, which is still there, that we are proud of, We are a former, of course, British colony, but located with Asia to our north, the Pacific Ocean to our east, and the Indian Ocean, indeed importantly as well, to our west. We're a large nation. We value our alliances, which are there and were forged during the Second World War under John Curtin. The then Prime Minister said we turn to the United States. Ever since then, that relationship has been critical. But we are also part of the Pacific family, but we're also a strategic partner as well, importantly with ASEAN. And if you look at my personal engagement and the engagement of my government, historically as well, particularly Labor governments have looked to our north. Our Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, has visited all of the ASEAN nations and every single Pacific Island Forum nation as well. I myself have visited Singapore, Cambodia, Indonesia twice, Papua New Guinea and Japan 3 times in the region. Our focus, we are part of this region. Increasingly as well, if you go to Australia, what you'll see is those close connections which are there. So my friend, the Singaporean Defence Minister, of course, when he was in Australia recently, he would have been visiting as well, I'm sure, the support that we give to his men and women in the Singaporean Defence Force who are trained and present there in Queensland and in other parts of Australia. Those direct linkages are really important. The relationship that we have in our region is important as well. And I think it is a matter of Australia as a middle power. What my government seeks to do is to maintain our relationships with our formal allies, but increasingly to be engaged with ASEAN countries, whilst also we've played, I think, an important role in ensuring that the Pacific Island Forum, that did have some issues that needed to be dealt with when we came to government just 1 year ago, has been brought back together and is once again a cohesive body going forward with all members participating. And that's important. We seek to bring together people and nations in every possible forum that we can. And I think that is a role that a nation such as Australia can play, being a force for dialogue, being a force for more unity, less division, trying to engage in a constructive way, looking for common purpose, not looking for disagreement. Disagreeing where we must with our values, which we maintain, but trying to look to bring together nations in a more coherent way. That's the driving force of my government. It's one of the reasons why we've participated in so many of the global forums, and I think that we have also encouraged, we have an improved relationship with China. We want to cooperate where we can with China as well, and we see that as a positive thing. The dialogue had broken down. There is now dialogue. It is always good for people to develop understanding and engagement.
Prime Minister, that question was so comprehensive and your answer so complete that I think the audience is very satisfied and ready to offer you the supper for which you have sung. So thank you very much indeed.